But what I always say is that the conflict itself is not a religious one. For many Palestinians, it's very simple. It's an issue of justice and issue of human rights violations. And for them, even the solutions are simple because of that. So for Palestinians, it is more about a settler colonial apartheid system that is taking over their lands. And it's about their right to stay in that land and to defend it. Palestine was one of those lands, and it was a strategic piece of land because Palestine was on the crossroads in the trade routes from Europe to Asia, and it was in the Mediterranean. It was a country that had a lot of strategic importance, and at the same time, when the Ottomans lost, the powers who won divided the land amongst themselves. But also, after the establishment of the State of Israel, many of these governments have businesses with Israel.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hello everyone to you Triple I podcast library host. Today we have our guest Dr. Kholoud al-Ajarma. Welcome, Doctor. If you let me introduce Dr. Kholoud al-Ajarma, PhD in anthropology and comparative study of religion from University of Groningen, Netherlands, MA in peace study and conflict resolution from Coventry University, UK, MPHL in anthropology and development from University of Bergen, Norway. Work as a lecturer in the university and deliver course in Muslim studies and Islam and minorities. Current research focus on water resource and management and environmental concern in the Muslim world. Is that true?
Yes, that's fine.
Great. Chevening visiting fellow at Oxford Center for Islamic Studies, base fellow of the MENA cohort fellowship program of United Nations Alliance of Civilization, awarded winning photograph and filmmaker, develop and lead programs and projects among refugee communities. Welcome, Dr. Kholoud al-Ajarma.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
We have today the topic of conflicts in Middle East, specifically Palestine case, and we want to know more about that from you. First, if you let me, from the historic context of Palestinian case, that from academic side. Mm-hmm. There are many academics and scholars who avoid to talk or write about Palestinian case with the same reason, including that, the issue is complex or the data is unclear, and for fact, we can find that, for example, I studied the last year about intervention in civil war duration, and when I studied the literature, I found some scholars avoid to talk about the conflict or in Palestine, so they said it's complex. And also I was study also about electoral system in Middle East, and the author many authors that we read about electoral system in Middle East, they avoid to talk about Palestine. So can you, did you think that the academic community has been fair to the Palestinian case historically?
Well, I think there are many points to raise about what you said about the fear or the reluctancy to speak about the Palestinian cause. I don't think there is lack of literature on Palestine in general, and a lot of academics have been speaking up on Palestine. But I think one aspect that is important to remember is when you speak about the Palestinian cause, it is not only a matter of academia, but it's a matter of activism. So a lot of people who would write about Palestine, they would also consider themselves activists or human rights defenders, because the two are connected in the Palestinian case. It's not a classical case of war or conflict where we talk about equal sides or people who have similar power. And also it is a case where a lot of people have been implicated over 75 years of the conflict, if we can call it so. There are many people who don't know how to frame it, also because of the historical guilt that a lot of countries have contributed to when it comes to the rights of Palestinians. And also the scale of it, it's massive. The Nakba of 1948 resulted in 750,000 refugees, the largest number of refugees at the time, and still one of the largest refugee populations of the world. So when you talk about it, do you talk about the excuse me, the Palestinian refugees who remained in the historic Palestine? Do you talk about Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, the Arab region, Latin America, Europe? So the scale of it is really large. And also when we talk about, you mentioned electoral systems, for example, which is very tricky when it comes to Palestine. We had a Palestinian Authority starting 1993 after the peace process, but the Palestinian Authority, which soon after it came to Palestine, was trusted by the local populations, and soon after that, a few years after that, the people realized that the peace process is actually not working. And the most losers of this are the Palestinian people. And that's why when we had another election, at the time, the leading party, Fatah, lost, at least in the parliamentarian elections, and Hamas won, which angered the world, who speak to us or brag to us about democracy and about the right of people to choose who governs them. But when the Palestinians do it, oh, it's the wrong choice. So the authority at the time, when it was under Hamas, was boycotted by the international community, including cuts of aid, including like cuts of diplomatic relations, because they didn't recognize Hamas as a representative of the Palestinian people. Because of that, a few years after that, there was a split in the power dynamics in Palestine between Fatah and Hamas, and ended up in Hamas mainly taking control over the leadership of Gaza, Fatah in the West Bank, and the Palestinian president taking over almost all powers, which is, again, it complicates the typical way we look at elections and who represents the people. The same when it comes to talking about refugees. Like it's a very complicated issue. The same when it comes to talk about borders or environmental resources, etc., etc. So every one of these issues are complicated to people who look maybe from the outside. For many Palestinians, it's very simple. It's an issue of justice and issue of human rights violations. And for them, even the solutions are simple because of that. So for Palestinians, it is more about a settler colonial apartheid system that is taking over their lands, and it's about their right to stay in that land and to defend it. But again, for an outsider, it might be overwhelming, and it might look like a topic that they don't want to get involved with. Another aspect that I'd like to mention is that, unfortunately, a lot of people who speak out on Palestine get attacked and accused of anti-Semitism, which is has been used and documented among pro-Palestinian scholars in the UK, for example, who have been accused for anti-Semitism just because they spoke about defending the rights of Palestinians. So maybe some scholars would say, oh, I want to stay on the safe side when it comes to, let's talk about an easier conflict to tackle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If my quote from Naomi Chomsky, he said that this is the last phase of European colonization. He meant the Palestinian case, and also Nelson Mandela also said that we know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of Palestinians. So why do the colonial and imperialist countries or powers maintain their policy in Palestine?
Well, there is a long history there. So I'm sure you're familiar with the First World War, the Second World War, and the implication that had on the Ottoman Empire and the lands that were under the Ottomans. Palestine was one of those lands, and it was a strategic piece of land because Palestine was on the crossroads in the trade routes from Europe to Asia. And it was in the Mediterranean. It was a country that had a lot of strategic importance. And at the same time, when the Ottomans lost, the powers who won divided the land amongst themselves. So France, for example, got a group of lands. England took a group of lands, and so on. And England, that took over Palestine, saw in it an opportunity to actually keep control on that region. And how do you keep control? You plant some of your allies there. So that's where the idea of having a Jewish state on the land of Palestine came. It came really from a group of anti-Semites who didn't want the Jews in Europe, and it was idyllic to have a state in Palestine for them, so that the Arab neighbors also would not have the capacity to unite, because they geographically they were united, they had the same language, they had the same religions almost, and that meant if they unite, they'll be a great power. And that was a danger to the European powers. So that's why a lot of people see in that history an aspect to look at when we look at what is happening in Palestine today. And that colonialism continued. So when Israel was established, it was a continuation really of that colonial process. Throughout the years of England's mandate, so-called mandate, colonization over Palestine, it facilitated the process. It promised a homeland for the Jewish peoples in Palestine in the Balfour Declaration in 1917. So all this was part of the ongoing problem and the ongoing colonization of Palestine.
Yeah, but even the document that rely on the Palestinian case, all of them coming from colonial countries, and colonial countries now say that that was past, that was history of colonialism. Now we have in the area of democracy, freedom, but they still rely on the document from colonization area, even in South, in South Africa, and now we still have the case of Palestinian, the case of Palestine. So
well, basically, the colonialism never ended. The face of it changed. So there are a lot of economic colonization that we see today of countries that have so many resources, but their resources are being grabbed and manipulated by foreign powers. We see this in many African countries, for example. We see cultural colonization where our traditions and our culture are being manipulated and seen inferior to European culture or American culture, for example. So I don't think colonization ever ended as such, but the face of colonization and the methods of colonization have changed. The other aspect is that for many of these powers who still see themselves as better and more superior than the global south or Palestinians or Middle Easterners or you name it, is the fact that they are benefiting from the system. So one aspect is that there is like huge guilt, especially among Europeans, of what happened to the Jews during the war, which is fair enough, like it was horrible. But also, after the establishment of the State of Israel, many of these governments have businesses with Israel, armed trades, they have diplomatic relations, they have now cybersecurity agreements and so on. And they think of their businesses and their own benefit more than the lives of human beings in Palestine or anywhere else. And that's why when it comes to the cost of human life, the human life becomes very cheap in their eyes. Although the human life should be the most important aspect that anybody thinks about.
Yeah, I have this quote after that, the quote from PC that's still true until today. You may give your opinion about that. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. We do seem to have, not evaluated all the much in 2,500 years until today. And superpower country do what they want, and we see that in UN Security Council. What do you think about this quote?
Yeah, it's unfortunately partially true. I don't think that the people themselves are weak. I think they're not being heard, which is different. I think the Palestinians are very strong in our will to stay and to defend our rights. For example, the fact that many people decide to remain on their lands when they have the opportunity to leave, for example, is not a weakness. But I think the governments mainly don't represent the people, and that's the problem. In many in many dictatorships, but also in the global north today, we saw millions of people demonstrate in London, for example, for Palestine, for Iraq before that, but the governments never listen. And that is the problem. When the people elect a government, the government should be the voice of the people. And when the people raise their voice, the government should stand alongside and represent them well, which is unfortunately not what we see. And that's why the strong, quote unquote, do whatever they want. And we also see this in the United Nations, where if we are united as nations, everyone should be equal. But that's not the case. The US can veto, for example, all the resolutions that were against Israel in the past days. And although millions and millions in the US and everywhere have voiced their opinion about what is happening now in Palestine and the human rights violations and the genocide that is happening in Gaza. But again, the strong are the ones who are leading there. And I don't think they would ever be forgiven for what they are doing now, because they are really like contributing to the genocide.
Also, along history, we see that all Western countries supported Israel, while Arabic country or Islamic countries, they can't, even reach the humanitarian aids to Palestine. So why we seem to be like controlling by strong country?
Yeah, that's why I say colonialism never ended, because many of those countries, whilst on the surface we see them as democratic countries and free countries, free nations, they're not. Many of them have deals with the US that they're scared of cutting ties. Many of them have businesses with European powers. And also there is the fear of how would this impact these governments on the long run. So why does the US, for example, have military bases in our countries? Why do we sell oil to these countries? Like, it's, you know, the businesses and the financial gain for some of these dictatorships really come as the priority. It's not that Muslim nations or Arab nations are weaker, because we know that the voice of the people is very strong, and we see that in the recent boycott campaigns. We see this in people marching on the streets in support of Palestine and so on. But it's really the systems, and who brought these systems. These systems are either dictatorships that have been for generations without elections, or armies taking over, or in the best of cases, elected elite that doesn't really represent the voice of the people on the ground.
Yeah, maybe you can say that it's not weak, but they try to keep their interest, away, because interest always, it's like a chain with strong country.
Yeah.
So I also have one question about historical context, and that's question about religion, and the religion influences the case of Palestine in both sides, in Israel, in Israeli we can call occupation and Palestinian country. This religion motivated the conflict or influences the conflict. We can choose the concept.
Yeah, I was asked this before here in Indonesia, actually, because I know people have a lot of support for Palestine from a religious point of view, which is I sympathize with. But what I always say is that the conflict itself is not a religious one. And this is what a lot of the time Israel tries to portray it as such, to play on the long-going, not fear, but like this guilt that Europeans have against the Jews, and the Islamophobia that still exists in European and American countries, where it is easy to say it's Jews against Muslims. Whereas historically in Palestine, Jews, Muslims, Christians, other minority religions existed, and that was not a problem. The problem was a settler colonial issue after the establishment of the Zionist Congress, which was a secular Congress. It mainly, like the Zionist movement itself, which advocates for a home for the Jewish people in Palestine, is a secular movement. It wasn't built on the idea that Jews have a right in Palestine from a religious perspective. However, when many Jewish people were living in European countries or Arab countries and did not want to migrate, Palestine was used as the win card to actually convince them that, this is the promised land. When the first Zionist Congress was held in 1897, Palestine wasn't even one of the countries suggested for this homeland for the Jewish populations. Argentina, for example, was one of the countries offered at the time. Some parts of Russia. Uganda, I think, was one of the countries. But how do you convince all these people to go to these countries? They have no connection from a religious perspective, no connection from a psychological or emotional perspective, but they did with Palestine when we talk about the historical linkage with Judaism and Palestine. So that was one of the reasons why religion was used as a way to motivate all these Jewish populations to migrate to Palestine in the 1920s and 1930s. And obviously, when the migration numbers escalated, Palestinians were alarmed. But before that, when the Jewish population was around 3% of the Palestinian population, they were not. They were just a dynamic members of the Palestinian community. And obviously, there was a lot of Christian communities that lived in Palestine. There was a lot of Christian migration outside of Palestine because of the regulations of the Ottoman Empire. So the current demography is that Muslims are the majority, but this is not because it is a religious conflict. This is because how religions evolve, and a lot of people who were once maybe Jewish or Christian in Palestine became Muslims with the coming of Islam, the conquests to the region, and etc., which affected the demography and the populations. And another thing that is important to remember when people talk about Israel-Palestine is a lot of the time they think of Israel as a Jewish state and Palestine as a Muslim state, whereas many Palestinians are not Muslims. So there is like the Christians, there are many other religious minorities, and there are many Palestinians who still live in what is now Israel. So there are Palestinians who either were displaced in areas that were occupied in 1948 or never, their cities were never attacked in the same way, like Nazareth. And these people are considered Israeli citizens today, but they are also Muslims, Christians, Druze, and so on. So that is also another aspect that people often forget. And as I said, I think it's easier to say it is a religious conflict than people can just take sides to whatever religion they support. But in reality, it's a demography and land colonization problem. It's a settler colonial problem.
Yeah, when you talk about the Jewish from Arabic country migrated to Palestine, actually we come to Yemen Jewish. Mm-hmm. We still have, in my village, we still have like houses, they call them Jewish houses. Mm-hmm. And even the documentary of some lands that say this person buy this land from the Jewish person. And as I know about the Yemeni Jewish, they are forced to migrate to Israel, and you know, they have difficult situation when they found there's a documentation about mm-hmm. that. And also to dig this, there are many Jewish protests now in New York and in many countries around the world mm-hmm. Palestine.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Actually, and that's also something that people often forget is the diversity of the Jewish people themselves. So the Arab region has very vibrant, very mixed Jewish communities. In Morocco, their neighborhoods were called al-Mallah, and they were where Jewish people lived. Also Tunisia, also in other Middle Eastern countries where the Jewish people lived, and they had they were participating in the economy and the culture, etc., etc. But a lot of the time, people associate what happened to the migration process with also Jewish people choosing to migrate. There were a lot of forces, let's say, that also helped in the migration process. The situations they were living under in many countries, in some places even there were attacks that were incited by the Zionist militias to actually make the Jewish people feel that they were in danger and that they had to migrate. And this is documented, this is not me saying.
Yeah, also.
But the other point that you mentioned, rightly so, is that many people make it equal to think about Judaism and Zionism, and they're totally different things. So Judaism is a religion. A lot of people might be Jewish and decide not to be Zionist, and many people can be Zionist and not be Jewish at all. And the other aspect is that a lot of the Jewish people who are not Zionist, excuse me, they are supporter of the Palestinian cause because they, from a religious point of view, they believe that what the state of Israel is doing under the name of Judaism is wrong. And from a human and religious point of view, they oppose the Israeli policies against the Palestinians and the ongoing slaughter of the Palestinians that the Israeli state is doing.
Okay, let's talk about the organization's role in the Palestinian case. And we say that UN, try and they can't find any solution. And we also say in the General Committee of UN that we're 120 countries, they voted for ceasefire, and just US that the one use the veto power to cancel any resolution from UN. And we see this limitation or limited role. And do you think that from the history of this organization working in the ground that they have limited role in the ground, and if we can say that they're still under the interest of the power country or the superpower country? What do you think about maybe UN and Security Council role?
Well, I understand why the United Nations was established to start with after the Second World War, and I understand the need to have such organizations that would advocate for human rights and like I think the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other declarations that were passed by the UN are really important and important to emphasize. But at the same time, the powers of these nations when it comes to questions like Palestine becomes very limited, and that's the unfortunate part. And this is unfortunately not only the case of Palestine. We saw that in many countries that were colonized in the recent conflicts, like in countries like Yemen and Libya and so on, where there is more that could be done to stop the wars, but unfortunately not the case in practice. When it comes to Palestine, I think there is something to remember when it comes to the role of these organizations is that which organizations are we talking about? Because maybe the largest organization working with Palestinians is the UNRWA, the United Nations Refugee and Works Agency, which was established in 1948 to look after the 750,000 Palestinian refugees. And for me, I think the role of UNRWA is essential because it is a role that includes the defense of the rights of the Palestinian refugees, although it is a humanitarian organization in principle. So UNRWA has no political power. When the refugee camp where I live in was attacked, and I wasn't still in school back then, and it was an UNRWA school because the UNRWA runs the education and health institutions for the refugees. The UNRWA officials couldn't even enter the camp because the Israeli army stopped them and didn't allow them in. So there is no power in the sense of intervention, but it's more of humanitarian intervention. And unfortunately, the meaning of this is that once the aid or the finances that UNRWA gets from UN member states ends, that also means that the work of UNRWA might end, and that's where the danger comes in. The United Nations members contribute financially to these organizations, and their contribution is not equal because obviously some countries are richer than others. And because of that, some countries, when the US, for example, under Trump, decided to withdraw its funding to UNRWA, it was a very, very difficult phase. So it's not only about the power of these organizations or what they want to do, it's about the power to actually commit to doing what they promised to do. And the clearest examples for the Palestinian refugees is the UN Resolution 194, which was passed after the Nakba in 1948. And the resolution clearly stated with member states' consent that the Palestinian refugees have the right to return to the places they came from, they have the right to compensation, and so on. Did that happen? No. And we are 75 years after that. So I think it's really about the power to to actually commit to the resolutions. And that doesn't happen often in a peaceful manner, not of the goodwill of countries. That happens when countries have pressure from countries like the United Nations and globally. The apartheid system in South Africa didn't end because the colonizers just decided we'll end the apartheid. It happened when there was massive boycott, divestment, and sanctions on the South African government for them to comply. Because if they're benefiting from the situation, why end it? Israel is benefiting from the occupation. They're selling arms, they're using the Palestinian lands, they're exporting our fruit and vegetable, etc., etc. So why would they end it?
Yeah, that's point. And also we have, beside the international organization, we have regional organization, maybe more about political organization like OIC, Arab League, and Gulf Council, Cooperation Council,
the GCC.
Yeah, and OIC actually, which I do my research about it. They have limited role, and they essentially or establish it just for the Palestinian case, and what the role they play in the situation in Palestine.
Well, I'm not sure how to give a satisfactory answer because I'm also very disappointed with their role, to be honest. I think one aspect that is important in their role is the status of Jerusalem, where at least on the surface, both Jordan and Morocco claim to be like guardians of the holy places and the Waqf in Jerusalem, including the Al-Aqsa Mosque and also like the other religious institutions and religious places. Some people say that that role is very important because without it, Israel would not shy from taking over these places. But in reality, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, for example, is violated every day. The Israeli army and the settlers, the attacks never stop. So it doesn't seem that Israel really takes into consideration these organizations. And at the same time, I don't see their involvement go beyond financial aid, really. So it's more about, looking after the mosques, sometimes sending aid to families, sending like financial support, in some cases also contributing to building schools or health centers, which is important, but it's not building a state. It's not empowering the people to be independent in a way. So it is still very limited, and I think any involvement that happens all the time has to go through Israel. If Israel approves, then it goes ahead. And that is the real danger, that these organizations, even if there's goodwill, even if they want to contribute, it would not be even allowed without Israel either saying yes or saying no to it.
So the humanitarian organization like the Red Cross or other humanitarian organization has better role in aid and helping the situation in Palestine more than this, maybe you can say, diplomatic or political role.
Yeah, I think the diplomatic role is really very limited because of the situation. Whilst aid you see on the ground, it's easier to see and easier to implement. Whilst I think diplomatic relations would take years and years and need the political will to change, which doesn't exist, I believe. And with organizations like even the Red Cross or the Red Crescent, I don't think Israel has a lot of say on it because there's pressure to actually get those organizations working on the ground. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that ambulances haven't been attacked, people been arrested whilst they are on the way to the hospital, hospitals being raided by the Israeli army, etc., etc. So there is also even when it comes to the humanitarian aid, it's always very complicated. and it's not an easy and a straightforward process.
Yeah. Also, if I may, phrases that one of official U.S. foreign ministry, he's one of employee in foreign ministry, and he said that when they do the investigation in Palestine, after they confirm one situation of rape for child in 13, age 13, and when they confirm this status, that actually Israeli authority close this investigation organization, and they pointed them as terrorist organization, even if they come from US.
Yeah. Well, a couple of years ago, 5 very prominent human rights organizations in Palestine were labeled terrorist organizations. And the US haven't even questioned it. They haven't even met with the people who are human rights defenders, people who have worked for the rights of children, the rights of prisoners, to document Israeli violations for human rights for years and years. And the US security, they didn't even question it. Like, they take anything that Israel tells them for granted. And in the recent events, we saw how many lies they just took over in their media and their spokespeople. And yeah, it's really, I don't know, more sad and scary than makes people angry, I think.
We talk about the neighbor countries like Jordan, Egypt, and they also controlling by the authority of Israel, if it's not directly, indirectly, by pressure, by put a lot of pressure in them. So how did you say that the role, the role of these countries?
Well, again, I would differentiate between the people and the governments. I think the people in general have amazing support for Palestine in terms of their solidarity, in terms of their actions. But at the same time, the governments are very, they don't really represent the voice of the people. They also take into consideration their own benefits, where, like, they have deals with Israel, for example, that a lot of people demanded the government to cut ties with Israel, but there is like a peace process that happens, especially when you talk about Egypt and Jordan. They're sharing borders, so there is, I think, that concern over the future, even if there's a peace process. And in some of these places also there is like a lot of internal issues that, the people are, even though they care for Palestine and for Palestinians, it's not the priority. The priority is to put food on the table. The priority is to find a job. The priority is to get the children to go to a hospital or to get proper education. And as long as there is so much social hierarchy and injustice socially and politically in these countries, that would be the first priority. It wouldn't be people in another country.
Yeah, this takes us to the next point, which is the Middle East conflict. We see conflicts around Middle East, in Yemen, in Sudan, in Syria, and the context of this conflict within the Palestinian issue. Even in Yemen, we raised that Palestinian case is like a holy case. So anyone who talk any political party who talk for Palestinians, that we will support it. This we will support it, even if it is wrong. So and we say they use the case of Palestinian in the context of this conflict. For example, Sudan, before the war or the conflict, there was like normalizing relation between Sudan and Israel. And for Yemen, we say now Houthi group tried to attack an Israeli ship coming from Red Sea, and in Syria also we can say that even we talk about in Syria about Sunni and Shia and supporting of Palestine. How did you say the Palestinian case within this image of conflicts?
Well, there are many points here. One thing is that it's true. A lot of the time, many political parties in the region use the Palestinian case to raise their profile. Rightly so, because if you're corrupt and you want, even if you're not corrupt, even if you're a normal person and you want to
clear your image.
To clear your image, you associate yourself with a better person. And everyone knows that, like, the Palestinians are the people who have, for 75 years, fought for their rights, for justice, for their right to live in dignity. So it's very easy, and also because the Arab populations have a lot of respect and also like emotional support for Palestinians. It's easy to raise your profile if you associate yourself with the Palestinian struggle, because it's a just struggle. So it raises your profile. But at the same time, it is very unfortunate to see these conflicts unfold, because for us, we know, well, hopefully we know who the enemy is. We know that we live under a settler colonial regime, and that's who we should resist. Whereas in neighboring free countries, the oppressors are people among the people, in a way. They are the people who should be representing their communities and representing their citizens. So it is sad in that sense. And when we all learn about human rights and democracy and all these values, and we see how dictators, or in electoral democracies, we see these dictators taking shape, it is very sad, even for us. So it's a bit complicated to think about it from a Palestinian perspective, but I think in general it is a bit unfortunate that in many of our countries there is this hierarchy. There are people who are benefiting from the system, obviously, that's why it still exists. And more often it's the very few leaving the most of the people in need and in really struggling for daily survival.
If I talk about the competition power in Middle East, between Saudi Arabia, Iran, and how that affect in the situation of Palestine. We say, many claims that Iran supported, Hamas and Saudi Arabia to fighting Iran, but they normalized the relationship in that. And we say Iran tried to influence or intervene in other countries like Yemen, Syria, and how this competition of power in Middle East affected the Palestinian case.
I think there has always been a competition over who are the leaders, let's say, in the Middle East, and this has to do with influence. That is, maybe the easiest way is the financial help, because then you have influence because you're helping financially, which is the case of Iran, which is the case of Saudi Arabia. And also historically there has been also more influence by the media. A lot of the TV satellite channels are Saudi funded, and how these in the past 20 years or so have also entered every house in the region, not only Palestinian houses, and how that also influenced the way it influenced people religiosity, it influenced people culture. There are so many ways that these powers are being manifested today. I think cultural and financial are the most obvious, but also who also gets to to influence like the movement of people, who gets to offer the jobs to people, who has the ability to influence the political decision making. And I think not only within the region, but globally, the World Bank also has a lot of influence. Whoever gets more funding or whoever gets more grants has more power. So I think mainly like financially is the largest impact that they compete over. And because they have more resources, obviously being oil producing countries. Diplomatically, I would say they're both limited. At least like many of the interventions that they tried to contribute to, like it would be like the political parties going to Riyadh, talking for a couple of days, coming back, nothing changes on the ground. So I don't see a lot of influence like in that sense, but they do have cultural, religious, and also like financial influence.
Yeah, one last question, that it's about the value. Which is the basic value? Is it justice or peace? Or they can be together or they can't be together? For example, for Yemen, my opinion that actually justice is the basic value. You know, we are not fair to go to the war if we return back with justice for all people. But we can't live in injustice.
Absolutely.
Even if we live in peace, but we still have.
Absolutely, and that's what Palestinians also would say. They would say there's no peace without justice, and justice is very important, because even if you have peace for 1 day, 2 days, it would never be everlasting if the people inside, they feel that they are being marginalized, if their rights are being violated. And they might be silent for a day, for 2 days, but eventually they will rebel against injustice. And that's why justice is, for me, is the most important value.
Yeah, and generation actually changing, you know.
Oh, yeah.
And we see that the globalization and people start, you know, to live with many nationalities, and for that, for this big movement of globalization, can this change the situation in Palestine?
Well, I think there's a difference between peace and tolerance still. Like what you're talking about is more about tolerance. And tolerance is obviously very important. It's important to respect that people have different cultures, they have different religions, they have different backgrounds, migrants or non-migrants. But at the same, and it's important to learn to tolerate these differences. But at the same time, that doesn't mean being passive to injustice that might happen in the name of, oh, but we should tolerate. If I'm a migrant in a place where I have Islamophobia, or if my rights are being violated, I should say, oh, but I should be thankful that I'm a migrant here. That's not how it works. If my rights are being violated, I should speak out, even if that doesn't deny that I'm grateful, for example. And that's the way it has to go everywhere. Unfortunately, that's not the way it is, but that's how I believe it should be.
Yeah, it's true. So, did you still have anything to share with us about the situation in Palestine, especially these days? I almost spend all my time following the news, the talk show, everything about Palestine, because I think it's like a central issue. I think if the Palestinian case solved, all our conflicts in Middle East will be solved. What do you think?
Yeah, well, that's a lot of responsibility for the Palestinians. I think, you obviously know what is happening now, and it's basically genocide that is happening on the and the world is watching it live. I think it's unfortunate, and I think that more could be done, especially by Muslim countries and Arab countries to stop what is happening, to put pressure on the countries that are actually supporting Israel in this war. And I think that people anywhere have the right to resist their occupiers. So it is very important to remember that when thinking about what is happening in Palestine. I don't think if the Palestinian cause is solved, that would end the problems, because there is so much injustice that is happening in other parts of the world. But I think that it would be one step in the right direction. I think the more awareness we have about the right of self-determination, the right of people to live in dignity, the right of people to live in freedom, the more we progress as human beings, and that would help us choose people to represent us, and those people would also fear the responsibility that they are given. So I think it's really important that we all work towards having better communities wherever we are, not only in Palestine.
Yeah, I still have this question in my mind. Just forgive me that all my talk about political
That's fine.
aspect, but we see also these days many countries talk about changing the system. It's not just one-way system. In international perspective, international law, they wanted to change the system. So no country has, this power to stop other countries from intervening to end this genocide in Gaza. And United States stand like a policeman of the world, and they not let any country to intervene and ending the genocide. What do you think? Can the countries now, or the situation now, is appropriated to change the international system?
I'm not sure about the international system, but I do think that the US is behaving the way it does, same as Israel, because they think they can't get away with it. And the way to change that is that not to get them away with it, is for countries who really think and brag about being pro-Palestinian to cut diplomatic relationship with either and both Israel and the US, to use their power, to use their diplomatic, economic relationships. Because unless real pressure is put on those people, they would never change. Why would they change if they think they will get away with it? And I think internally there is a lot of growing knowledge about what is happening. There is a lot of internal pressure put on these systems. But unfortunately, it is still not to the extent that change is happening. But I'm really hoping that with more people acting out and with more pressure put on these systems, that they would eventually change, because otherwise we would be doomed. It would be very bad for the humanity as well.
Yeah, but for many countries, they think that their interest, economic interest, and the situation now in the world they live in economic crisis, and even the war between Russia and Ukraine. US put a lot of sanction in Russia, and they still have these issues in the world, and also the world still recovery from COVID-19. And they said if we cut or make sanction economically, we will damage it, all the damage about that.
Yeah, but that's where we come to think about the historical dependency that we created. And I think it's time to cut loose with that dependency. Many of our countries have resources to build from within if there was a political will. But a lot of these countries are, like, all their resources are controlled by a handful of people who are just being richer and more influential, whilst the normal people don't get any of these resources. So I think the solution, in my point of view at least, is to cut from that dependency, because as long as we're dependent on financial aid or on these relationships that we have with the US or with Europe, it is important to keep relationships, obviously, and diplomacy is very important, but to be dependent on them is where we would always be afraid of losing that dependency. And I think our countries have a lot of resources, human resources and natural resources, to be built from within with proper leadership and with proper interventions. And of course, like the Arab region has a lot of educated people. It has, if we're talking about the Arab region at least, there are a lot of promising young people who, if they were given the opportunity, they can contribute to building these countries. So it's really a matter of appreciating the humans and for every human life to matter, really.
From your point of view, that we say, can we say a near solution, or
inshallah?
Yeah,
to me, I think a solution would be when Israel actually is stopped from what they're doing, and when real pressure, including economic sanctions and boycott and divestment from Israeli companies, happens. Because as long as Israel is benefiting from the occupation and the colonization, it is not good for, they would never stop. But I really have a lot of hope for humanity, and also a lot of hope for the young generations who have never been to Palestine, for example, but they listen to the stories from their parents, they read about it, they learn from social media now. And a lot of young generation that people had at some point no hope in them being enlightened and educated about what is happening, they are speaking out now, and they are contributing to raising awareness about what's happening. So I really have a lot of hope in this generation.
I also have hope.
Inshallah.
We can do something. Do you still have something to share with us?
No, thank you for having me.
No, thank you so much to listening to us through this time. Thank you, Dr. Kholoud al-Ajarma.
Oh, thank you too.
It's being an honor for us.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm also very happy to be at the university here, which is also like a very bright place to be, when there are a lot of bright students and faculty members who are also contributing to raising a generation that is more aware of what is happening in the world, and hopefully they can contribute to a better world as well.
Yeah, I hope so also.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being listening to us. Thank you.